What are your thoughts on feminism in Western and developed countries? I believe I know your thoughts about the subject in developing and religious countries, but I'm curious what your take is on women's issues in modern societies. Well, again, much of what I said about identity politics applies here. It sort of depends on what you mean by feminism, because this, as you know, can mean many different things, some of which are clearly crazy, and some of which you'd have to be crazy or at least immoral not to endorse. So there's quite a range. I mean, do you mean Andrea Dworkin feminism? Do you mean Naomi Wolf? Do you mean this intersectionality, moral panic we're noticing on college campuses? Do you mean people who will not admit that there's any difference biologically between men and women apart from the reproductive system? Or do you mean people who completely disavow evolutionary psychology and think that every human being is born a blank slate? Or do you simply mean people who are concerned about equity and fairness in our society and who acknowledge that there are situations where women have a harder time than men and that we should understand those situations and correct for those injustices? If the latter, well, then I consider myself a feminist. But generally speaking, I mean, I was raised by a single mom, and I am the father of two daughters. I realize this line of argument carries absolutely no weight with the victimologists out there, but it is nonetheless true to say that I am deeply committed to making the world a better place for women. And this sort of links back to my discussion of firearms at the top here. I do view this through the lens of self-defense for women rather often. And when you think of what it's like to be a woman in the world, surrounded by men who outweigh her by 50, 60 pounds, a world where rape and other forms of sexual violence is a everyday reality, and there are cultures where it's a greater reality than in others. I do think that there is an asymmetry here that men shouldn't ignore and that women are right to emphasize. So I am absolutely concerned about violence against women, and I'm a great advocate of women preparing to deal with that kind of violence. And if there is an argument for owning a weapon like a gun, I think the argument only gets stronger when you talk about a woman living alone and what she should own to protect herself. But clearly, under the aegis of feminism, the conversation can swing way too far in the opposite direction, where all men are cast as potential rapists and creeps for every moment of their lives. There's a way of demonizing men that one notices online that is just delusional and totally unproductive. So again, one has to speak honestly about what's actually going on in the world and what the real risks are for, in this case, women in various situations. But recent stories of the sort that we are now hearing about, Harvey Weinstein and other men in positions of power like that, and these are horrible stories, and these are stories that only run in one direction. We're not talking about men being sexually victimized and preyed upon by rapacious women who are in positions of power over them, right? That's not what's happening. We're not having groping scandals or rape scandals that run the other way. And there's a reason for that. Evolutionarily, there's a reason for that. Physically, there's a reason for that. Psychologically, there's a reason for that. Culturally, there's a reason for that. But still, there's an asymmetry here that you have to be extraordinarily obtuse to ignore. And if feminism is an honest response to that, well, then I'm a feminist, right? Harvey Weinstein should have had the shit kicked out of him long ago. The fact that all these people covered for him was an astonishing moment of cultural pathology. And we should point out that many of the people covering for him were women. Women do not get off scot-free in this. Imagine the women who worked for him who were not being sexually coerced by him, but who were actually pimping for him, essentially. There's enough opprobrium to go around here, but the reality is that women were uniquely vulnerable and have traditionally been uniquely vulnerable to this kind of predation. And I think we should have zero tolerance for it. So call me a feminist there. Again, I see this very much through the lens of self-defense and the ethics that apply there. And I think men have a responsibility not to be creeps. And if you're an honest man who is well-intentioned toward people generally, you have to acknowledge the capacity for men in general to be creeps. And you have to take some responsibility for falling on the right side of that line, wherever it is. And granted, the line can be hard to find, right? I mean, there are all of these cases where seemingly innocent flirtation in public or in a work environment is now getting categorized as a kind of harassment, right? And the line can be very difficult to find. I don't tend to live in those situations myself. And obviously I'm married and, I'm not a single guy struggling to work this out for himself out in the world. But these interactions are becoming increasingly fraught, and the fuse on both sides is getting shorter and shorter, where you have women who are, like everyone else, it seems, being moved by the spirit of identity politics more and more, categorizing everything as a kind of assault, and you have a kind of bro culture of young men being born online that is beginning to view women as the enemy across the board here. So again, I'm somewhat distant from all this. This is not my world, but I can see how it's showing up, in particular online. It strikes me as incredibly dysfunctional. And this links back to that question about intentions. It matters what people's intentions actually are. It matters what the character of a person's mind actually is. This is why it's bad to relax definitions of rape so much that you can't distinguish between rape and something like sexual harassment, or even a sexual assault that's not a rape, right? I mean, being groped is not the same thing as being raped, right? And the kind of person who would grope a woman on a subway isn't precisely the same person who would rape them at knife point. There are gradations even to the most pathological behavior. All the details matter. And I worry that in talking about many of these things, we are showing more and more a susceptibility to a kind of moral panic and sloppiness. Words are becoming meaningless. The word racist is virtually meaningless now, given the way it's being used. And a phrase like sexual assault, one isn't actually sure what is meant by it, given the way it's often used. So we need to be more careful in how we talk about these things, and we need to be genuinely interested in what people have been intending, right? I mean, this is the other thing that's happening online, where a misstep that is clearly not intended is leading to the absolute obliteration of a person's reputation, simply because the worst possible reading, the least charitable possible reading of his or her words or actions is being enforced, even when there's endless evidence that there's more to that person than can be summarized by such a reading. So it matters who people actually are, rather than what they can be made to seem to be by their enemies, or by hysterics, or by people who are just not taking the time to figure out what's going on.